Hi, I'm Mr. Simons, and in this video we're going to have a quick look at how wages are determined in the Australian economy. If we think about the Australian labour market as a whole, this graph that I'm showing up here could be quite useful in terms of thinking in a big picture sense about how wages are determined. I like seeing graphs. They help me think a bit more clearly rather than enormous chunks of text. So what I think you should look at here is that there are a couple of main ways that wages are determined in the Australian economy. So you've got awards, you've got enterprise agreements, and you've got individual contract. In terms of classifying it in our system, you have what they call kind of like the formal system. This includes, struggling with the words, this includes the award system and those collective or enterprise agreements. If you see collective agreements or enterprise agreements, it's pretty much the same thing for our purposes. In the more informal system, you've got individual agreements, which are essentially highly paid, highly skilled workers negotiating individual contracts with their employers. And then you've got a plane going overhead. And then you've got people that run their own business, and so they don't form part of that formal system. But maybe that's a helpful way of distinguishing. So I've got awards, enterprise stroke collective agreements on one side, and then I've got those individual agreements and people who are self-employed on that informal side. So if we look at an award is a minimum set of terms and conditions in terms of someone's employment. Awards typically apply to relatively lower skilled, lower paid jobs where there is a need to have some kind of safeguards and protections for workers in those industries. So in the Australian system, an award is not like a prize for doing very well like you might have got at school. An award instead is like a safety net for workers. And what that means is it's there to catch people so that they don't get exploited or kind of end up worse off by taking a job. So if you're thinking about an award, okay, an award is like that minimum safety net set of pay and conditions that typically applies to people that are a bit lower skilled and lower paid. Now, this is not always the case, but an award really is that kind of typical minimum set of wages and conditions. So it's important to note that some employers do pay above award wages and conditions, and that is great for workers, but the award sets that minimum rate of pay and conditions that employers must pay. Another thing to think about is there is not one award for the Australian economy, that if you go and get a job, you are not signing up to the same award as someone in a different industry. That awards are industry specific. So if you're working in fast food, you might have the relevant award there. If you're working in retail, in a big department store, you might fall under a different award. If you are taking a job in an office, there might be, again, a different award. So awards are industry specific, and it's not one set of wages and conditions for everyone across the Australian economy. So when you move beyond awards that are that kind of industry level minimum wages and conditions, although some employers may pay higher than that minimum, you then move to enterprise or collective agreements. Now, enterprise or collective agreements apply to everyone at a particular workplace. So enterprise or collective agreements, that's for people at a particular workplace, hence that word enterprise, so in a business, or collective, applying to a bunch of people. So they're typically negotiated between a union representing that enterprise or the collective and the employers. And what there is there's more flexibility than an award. So an award sets out the minimum, you can go above it, but you can't really change that minimum. It's legislation. What you can do with an enterprise agreement is you can say, well, let's have that, but let's leave that out. Employees might say, we're willing to work harder if you give us more money and better conditions. so that with an enterprise agreement, employees can trade off productivity for greater wages and conditions, so that employees can offer to work harder to get better wages and conditions and to leave some things out, to say, no, we don't want that, but we want this. And employers have to agree, obviously, but there is greater flexibility. Now, the important point is the boot, the better off overall test, is that under an enterprise or a collective agreement, yes, employers and employees can get rid of some conditions and prioritize others. But employees, the workers overall, must be better off overall on the enterprise agreement than the relevant award. A little bit confusing, I'll just do it one more time in case it's helpful. So when you have a collective or enterprise agreement and employees sit down with employers, or the unions sit down with employers, yes, you can trade off wages and conditions, but in an overall sense, employees must be better off overall under the enterprise or collective agreement than the relevant award. So the other piece in terms of moving to the informal system is individual contracts or common law contracts. Basically what you've got here is you've got high-skilled, high-earning individuals that sit down individually with their employers and say, I want this, I don't want this. I want this, I don't want this. And employers are kind of like involved in a negotiation process with those workers because they are so unique in terms of their skill set or so powerful in terms of their earning capacity. Now, this level of individual negotiation is not available to people on awards or enterprise agreements because they don't have that same kind of status or negotiating power. So this type of arrangement does exist, and it allows a number of workers to kind of get the flexibility and the conditions and wages they really want because of their negotiating power. So the final piece, which is a relatively small part of the labour market, is in terms of self-employed people that sort out their own arrangements. So for example, under the award, enterprise agreement, common law contract, there is that requirement to be paid superannuation in terms of someone running their own business, that they're sorting out their arrangements, they're not being employed, so they don't really have to pay themselves superannuation if they don't want to or if they're not in a position to. Obviously, that will make things potentially more difficult later in their life, but they might be earning more money from their business. Either way, they have that flexibility. So again, a different type of industrial arrangement. Okay, so the final part here is that when we talk about awards, collective enterprise agreements, and individual contracts, that all of these have to meet 10 national employment standards, the NES. So whether you are on an award, enterprise collective agreement, or an individual contract, that it has to fulfill these 10 national employment standards. Now, I will include a link below to the NES and those 10 standards, but just for your own knowledge here, and while I've got you watching this, here's a couple of things that are part of the NES. Maximum weekly hours of work are in the NES. There's also the right to request flexible working arrangements. There's also the setting out the requirements in terms of leave, so things like annual leave, sick leave, carers leave, personal leave, that kind of stuff. And there is also a discussion about redundancy and termination pay and what people are entitled to. So the national employment standards applies to those awards, those enterprise collective agreements, not corrective agreements, and individual contracts. There are 10 standards, and that those contracts must meet the NES. Okay, so this was a pretty short overview in terms of the Australian labour market in the context of how wages and conditions are determined in terms of people's employment arrangements. So just be clear on the relative significance of each arrangement and what they all involve. Any clarifications, just add them to the comments. And as always, thank you very much for watching.